And today we're very pleased to have June Manning Thomas speaking to us about her new book, Struggling to Learn, Legacy of an Incomplete Civil Rights Movement, a book which is very much autobiographical as well about her own life and childhood in South Carolina. Born and raised in South Carolina, she went to Michigan State University for her degree, continued to teach there for a while, also taught at Cleveland State, and most recently at the University of Michigan, also right there in the same area of southeastern Michigan. She's published quite extensively, and she's now the Mary Frances Berry Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. In addition to that, she has served on 2 regional Baha'i councils, the Council for the Midwestern States when it was first established in the late 90s, and then more recently on the Midwestern Council for Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. So today we will be hearing from her about the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation, June. Thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you. Very happy to have you joining us today, whenever you're watching, morning, afternoon, or evening. Very pleased that Wilmette Institute invited me to come and just talk a little bit about this work and the associated issues related to the civil rights movement. So the title of this talk is Struggling to Learn, Legacy of an Incomplete Civil Rights Movement. That is not the title of the book. The title of the book is An Intimate History of School Desegregation. But today I'd like to take just an aspect of that book and talk about the civil rights movement and implications for today. So it's just a part of the overall book itself. So there you see the title of the book, An Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. And so today, what will we cover? We'll look at what was the US Civil Rights Movement, just a brief description. Many of us think we know what that was, but I would like to just review some key features of that. Then I'd like to talk about how this book fits into that particular history of the civil rights movement, whether or not the civil rights movement was successful, which issues still linger, and then some comments on what is the solution to those issues with particular reference to principles of the Baha'i faith. So those are the 4 major aspects of what we'll cover today. And of course, we'll have questions and answers in case there's something that is not completely clear or something you'd like to investigate a little further. So the first thing is, what was the US civil rights movement? And of course, many of us have associations with that movement, either in terms of marches or in terms of individual leaders. The commonly used dates for that civil rights era, for this classical civil rights era, which is the one that most people think of, would be starting around 1954 with the Brown v. Topeka Board of Education case. And of course, that was the US Supreme Court's first ruling on the Brown lawsuit against Topeka, Kansas's segregated school system. And then some people say that this era ended about 1964 with the US Civil Rights Act. But probably a better ending date would be 1968, when the Voting Rights Act passed, which was also a US Civil Rights Act piece of legislation. And that's particularly important because the Voting Rights Act was possibly the most important and successful piece of legislation to be passed during this era. So people commonly think of this as this decade between 1954 and 1964 or 68. But actually, the civil rights movement started long before then. It took a lot of effort to get to that 1954 course case, for example. If you look back, this particular image is from 1935, and it shows a very young Thurgood Marshall on the left. And he and two other lawyers are preparing, NAACP lawyers are preparing for a case for school desegregation in the University of Maryland. So it took many small victories in court for there to be significant advance in terms of school desegregation litigation. But given the subject of today, it really is significant that it took all the way back to the 30s and even earlier to develop these early phases of the civil rights movement. And it was about education and desegregation of education. Many people think of the civil rights movement in terms of specific events or leaders. This image, for example, shows on the left, the tall man, Whitney Young from the National Urban League. It shows Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, John Lewis from SNCC, Walter Reuther from the United Auto Workers, who did collaborate with the organizers of the March on Washington in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we think of that movement in terms of these leaders and events such as that march. And most of the people we think of are men, but there actually were several key women, not just Rosa Parks, although Rosa Parks was certainly pivotal in importance. She and Dr. King were the leader and the initiator of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And so when we think of the civil rights era, we tend to think of those milestones, the significant boycotts, the significant marches, the significant leaders. And they are important. This is another image from the just after the March on Washington in 1963. And this particular image I love because these men are standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And I think this is symbolic of the challenge that the civil rights movement offered to the American ideal of justice for all and of democracy. And so certainly that was a pivotal challenge to that concept within the American democracy. And the names of these people are familiar. Of course, on the lower right, you see both Dr. King and Roy Wilkins. But actually, the civil rights movement was much more complex than just the marches and the events. There are three common lines of action that I will mention at some point today. One was the fight for equal accommodations, public accommodations, in lunchrooms, on beaches, in restaurants. This particular image is of the first student sit down in Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960. That launched a student initiative that spread around the nation, but it wasn't just lunch counters, it was also waiting rooms and many other aspects of everyday life. And then the second line of action was school desegregation. I already mentioned that the Brown case and the cases that preceded the Brown case were really important. And this, for example, this image from 1963 of Governor Wallace standing at the door of the University of Alabama and pledging not to admit any Black person. This is kind of symbolic of that era. There were several court cases to try to get past people who refused to accept school desegregation, even in universities. And then, of course, the third line of action I'd like to discuss today just a bit is voting rights. And this is the march from the famous Selma March, which ended in attacks by the police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Many people are not remembering this, but this was actually about voting rights, this particular march. So those were just some of the lines of action for this very complex civil rights movement. It was not just about the key events that we see pictures of all the time. It was also these everyday actions and continuing efforts in many venues. So if we summarize these: opening public accommodations, desegregating public education, and gaining voting rights, this was essentially what most of the efforts were focused on during that time. But I feel it necessary to just point out that there were other issues that were not selected for one reason or another. And those issues included poverty. This was a big issue that Dr. King later took up. The rights of workers, the prison industrial complex. There were a lot of issues that related to civil rights, but for tactical and strategic reasons, most of the efforts were focused on public accommodations, desegregating public schools, and gaining voting rights for obvious reasons. One is the visibility of public accommodations. And then, of course, public education is key to the concept of allowing people to get ahead on their own merits. And then, of course, you can't have citizenship without voting rights. So there were many reasons for focusing on these areas. So maybe that's a little review of what the civil rights movement was. The second question we said we talk about is, how does this book fit into that history? So if the US civil rights movement is a big movement of amorphous and spread throughout the nation, then this book actually talks about that movement from the perspective of one state and one small town. It's an important state and an important town, but nevertheless, it's just a small picture of what the issue was. I was in South Carolina 2 weeks ago giving talks, and several people came up to me with book ideas because they came from different towns or they had different experiences. And I'm sure there are 100 different books that could be written that have not yet been written about just this one state. And that's because we tend to focus on big stories, but I was trying to focus here on a smaller story. And so this one town, here is the one state, South Carolina, and the one town was Orangeburg, my hometown, where I grew up and lived until the age of 18. And so what I tried to do in this book was to talk about what was the nature of Jim Crow racial oppression. I actually wanted to give some personal experiences. So where it becomes autobiographical, it is in remembering things. So describing the nature of what that felt like from the perspective of a child. Then what did the civil rights movement look and feel like on the ground? And so also because I lived in this town that was a hotbed of the civil rights movement for several reasons, then there's pretty intimate description of the people involved and what that felt like. How did the Black community manage to be resilient and especially to raise its children? I'm particularly interested in this concept of constructive resilience, which is something that the governing body of the Baha'i faith, the Universal House of Justice, has talked about in terms of a subject people. And so the book talks about that in the language of constructive resilience. Then also, what were the triumphs and failures of one portion, the school desegregation movement, and then finally, what was the role of Baha'i concepts in this great struggle, all from the perspective of this one state and this one town. which allowed me to give pretty intimate dialogue about these particular issues. So today I'm just going to touch on a couple of these, 1, 4, and 5, the nature of Jim Crow racial oppression, the triumphs and failures of school desegregation, and insights from Baha'i concepts, with a little bit about the others as well. So if we go back to this chart, opening public accommodations, desegregating public education, and voting rights, this book covered mostly the first two, opening public accommodations and desegregating public education. So this racial segregation and public accommodations. So again, I think many of us have read about this or heard about this, but I was a child during that period. And so what the book tries to do in a reflective manner is just to discuss what that felt like for a child. And so I think that's an important educational process for most people, because it takes this era out of the abstract and puts it in the personal. You know, what did it feel like to sit in a colored waiting room? What did it feel like to sit in the balcony of a racially segregated movie theater? And so there's some description of those experiences, as well as what it felt like to go to school in a segregated public school in Orangeburg, South Carolina, the positive and negative effects of that, as well as a little bit, not so much, but a little bit about voter exclusion, particularly in terms of how that affected my parents and my grandparents. And then also, throughout the book, I occasionally refer to Baha'i concepts as a counterpoint to the situation that existed in the society at that time, which is the 1950s and the 1960s. And so, for example, when I'm describing the opposition to school integration in South Carolina in the 1950s, and I actually have to talk about racist concepts from that era, I end the chapter by talking about the Baha'i concepts and how those were different from the ideological untruths that were being propagated by people with vested interest in white segregation. And so the Baha'i concepts then serve as a counterpoint at various strategic places in the book, in the hopes that this book will be acceptable to all religions, to a secular audience. And they will see, when I describe these racist incidents and these racist concepts, that someone in the state, meaning the Baha'i community, as well as other people, part of the worldwide Baha'i community, were not accepting the teachings of racism. Also, what the book does is to describe the Orangeburg movement, which was a hometown version of the civil rights movement. Again, it wasn't all about marches in Selma or Birmingham or Washington, D.C. Many small towns had some form of a civil rights movement, and mine was no exception. This picture is probably somewhere between 1960 and 1963. And it shows the college students in my hometown from either Claflin College or South Carolina State College, who were rounded up for picketing against segregation. And they were put in this enclosure. The people you see there, on the man on the right is a fireman, because they would turn fire hoses on them. So we have our own legacy in that hometown of a noble history of resistance. One portion of that was the press for school desegregation. And so we children and youth were recruited to advance that section of the civil rights movement. And so this picture, which is also on the cover of the book, And one reason that the book is subtitled School Desegregation includes several of my classmates and myself who were being honored for being the first to arise in Orangeburg, South Carolina, to go to the white public schools. Our parents had to file suit for that to happen. I'm the person in the striped dress, and the person on the far right is my father, and the small child is my sister. So this would have been taken a few months before we entered the white schools. So as I said, there are only certain things I'm talking about today. I'm not talking so much about that experience as broader questions, such as the third part of this presentation. Was the civil rights movement successful? What issues still linger? So this question of, was it successful? Well, we saw that racial segregation in public accommodations, it was successful to a certain extent. So you don't see the colored and white signs anymore. You don't see the separate waiting rooms. There are many phases of life that are so different now than they were in 1962. So there have been many advances in that area. In terms of segregation in public schools, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but one of the issues that took place was we really saw a resegregation by race and class. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then voter exclusion, as I said, the Voting Rights Act was relatively successful compared to other aspects of the civil rights movement, but still there are problems with access to the ballot box. So I devote a chapter called A Nearby County Arises to experiences in the county, Clarendon County, right next door to my home county. And what that showed was a persistent effort that began in the mid-1940s for Black parents to get equal education in a situation where Black children were given the worst possible imaginable school facilities and were forced to walk to school because the school's district would not pay for buses for Black children. And so this is just an example of an effort, a very long effort that led to what became the Briggs v. Elliott case and was eventually folded into the Brown v. Topeka, Kansas. So it was successful in the sense that that kind of blatant discrimination is no longer acceptable, but then milder, more subtle forms of discrimination emerged. So for example, if we look at the transition from the post-Reconstruction era to purposeful separation and denigration, which took place in my state probably about 1895 with a new state constitution, leading to protests and litigation, such as I just mentioned in Clarendon County, then slow and fitful hostile desegregation, and that's what the book mostly describes, leading to what is now fairly unequal education. And so we see some progress. We see, for example, limited educational gains from kindergarten to 12th grade, access to white universities, which was particularly important for professional and graduate education. We see historically Black colleges, a big theme of the book, how those arose and how they survived. But we also see now skewed academic achievement by race. We see cases such as the Abbeville via State of South Carolina case that went on for over 20 years to try to get equal education for low-income Black students that failed in the end to do that. And then we see resegregation, such as in my hometown. So I discuss the evolution of what happened in this one town in terms of this very active effort to get better education for Black children by pursuing desegregation. And so this, I actually pulled up this chart yesterday. This is a description of Orangeburg District 5, which is the school district that I and my peers desegregated with 16 schools. And you can see that it's now resegregated. There are 87% Black in this particular school, and the students from low-income families, which is eligible for reduced lunch or free lunch, is 100%. And that's not because there aren't people of more means who live in that district, but it's because they have essentially moved to private education, to homeschooling, or they moved out of the district to resegregate themselves. Actually, this little ad on the right, Life Changing Fortis Academy, is an ad for a Texas school that also helps homeschoolers. So right there with the data on the school system is a way out for parents who want to homeschool. And this is another chart. This is in terms of science aptitude, and you can see the Black students are way behind compared to the white students. But none of them are doing well compared to the state as a whole. So this legacy, we see extremes of wealth and poverty. These issues still exist. We see unequal educational opportunity. We see prejudice and discrimination and hatred. This photo is from a Oath Keepers rally. The Oath Keepers are a paramilitary organization that very much supports the repression of minority race groups. And then, of course, repressed voting and other rights, such as the right to not be shot by the police on the streets. But this is a Black Lives Matter rally. So the real problem was not just these public accommodation, public education, and voting rights, but there was a fundamental system of economic and political oppression that I talk about in the book, and the problem of social separation. There was so much separation that there was no feeling of empathy or love or warmth or acceptance when the litigation went through. And that is because the real basis was racial prejudice institutionalized. So that was the bedrock, I think, of the incompleteness of the civil rights movement as pursued. So what is the solution to these issues? This is the last portion. A personal solution. So in the book, I described my own personal solution, which was to embrace the Baha'i faith. It was so obvious when I was going through this experience that there was only one community I could see that actually was living this ideal of true love between the races. So I described my gradual coming to awareness of this Baha'i community, and the epilogue describes fully my embrace of the Baha'i faith. But we also need a societal solution for this problem, this series of problems. This racial prejudice, this is the bedrock that needs to be eradicated. And instead of a system of economic and political oppression and social separation that we try to fix with access to public accommodations or public education or voting rights, what we need is a stronger system of economic and political social reform and social equality. And from that basis, the basis of racial prejudice eliminated, and then social reform, and then social equality, then we can really begin to see and conceptualize social reform. For example, the top row, social and economic development, complete education for all, not just desegregation, but complete and that means physical plus spiritual education that does not leave others out, as well as enlightened governance. And that's just not begrudgingly giving voting rights, but giving full access to decision-making for all people, all races, and all classes of people. So some of you might recognize that that's exactly what the worldwide Baha'i community is trying to do, is trying to implement these true social reforms. And we get letters that suggest how to do this. The Universal House of Justice sends these periodically. And in particular, there was an important one sent in July of 2020 that suggested several things. One is that any kind of progress made has been met by what they call countervailing forces, which means backlash. So we saw, for example, there were marches for civil rights, marches now for Black Lives Matter, but then you see the backlash marches that take place as well. So they suggest that we rely on the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those figures, they have very specific suggestions and guidance dating all the way back to the early 1900s. Throughout the mid-20th century about specific steps we could undertake to forego racial prejudice, which is the foundation of these problems that I've been describing. And then recognize the limitations of contest and conflict. That is, recognize that there's just so much we can do by conflictual efforts that we have to instead establish just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions. So it's a broader task than just the approach that we've been taking as a society at large. And then finally, they suggested we needed to realize that we're really just learning about these things. The Baha'i faith doesn't have the answers, but we've made progress in terms of trying to figure out the answers. And consulting, we've learned about consultation and how to bring together people of differing views and work together to shape collective action. And one way is this idea of love ablaze among members of the community through intimate conversations. So the conclusion chapter of my book talks about these concepts, the idea that we must essentially look at personal relationships as the bedrock for building true social reform. So also, we need to think at an appropriate scale. So sometimes we need to think in terms of neighborhoods and villages instead of trying to reform the whole country, maybe just our neighbors, getting together with our neighbors, small cities and villages, or clusters of localities. That's another way to think about how we can bring about racial unity. And then, of course, with enough of that activity, we're learning about how to transform the world. So the Institute process is one way to do that, but I think I'm past my time, so I think I'll end there, and maybe you will have questions about that. But this is one of the tools that Baha'is are learning about as a way to overcome the divisions in society and to create true social reform. So maybe we can just go to questions. I'm very happy again to share just some of the highlights of this book, as well as to talk about some of the broader implications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. That really is very interesting. And we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I will turn to those. One person who's anonymous asks this question. In the book, you consistently use the term desegregation rather than integration. And is there a specific reason for this, or was it just a matter of personal choice?
Yeah, I think integration implies a higher level of coming together than desegregation. Desegregation recognizes that there was a pretty strong system of segregation. It was pretty rigid. And when, for example, 13 of us went into that high school, we weren't really integrating it because we weren't well integrated. We were instead taking it from that status of segregation. So it was desegregation. And same thing with I think much of society. We are desegregated, but we are not necessarily racially integrated. So I tried to be purposeful about that. I'm sure a keen eye will see where I slipped every once in a while, but I think I was pretty consistent in using the terms. I saw one question: why do we not have leaders of the caliber of Dr. King and Malcolm X today? Well, these were really exceptional figures, exceptional men. Each one of them came from a specific background, and the moment was right. America was ready for the kind of intellectual and spiritual leadership given by Dr. King, and for the very specific challenge to racial hierarchy that we saw from Malcolm X. But I should say, when I was reading about the civil rights movement, I became more aware that even then, there were people that felt that it wasn't really right to depend so much on leaders. And for example, leaders get assassinated, and both of those men were such targets. They were visible and they were outspoken, and they had important things to say, but they were maybe too visible. And there were women in particular, such as Septima Clark, who worked very closely with Dr. King, who constantly told him, let the people develop their own leaders. Don't always think it has to be you. It's not safe, for one thing, but it also doesn't teach people to take control of their own destiny. So she said that many times to him, but she was not listened to. I think the momentum of leadership was too great. But you see with more modern movements like the Black Lives Matter movement that it's different. It's a different leadership model. There are several people who are leading that movement. And I think that's healthy, because otherwise it's not really broadly based. It's not so obvious that it's a popular movement. And you subject people to dangerous inclinations by zealots who don't like what they're saying.
Yes, thank you so much for that, June. We have a couple more questions. I noticed that Mr. Barnes has his hand raised, so if he would like to speak, we could promote him to be able to share his camera and to speak and to ask his question.
I didn't have any question particularly, but I just had words of deepest and warmest appreciation that June Thomas has presented her presentation. And I look forward to reading the book, because it just arouses new ways of thinking and understanding the civil rights movement, particularly the spiritual character of the civil rights movement. And I think that she touches upon that. And happy that we have a personal situation, her personal situation. And I move to have the picture of her, and I look forward to knowing more about her family. And the only other comment that I'd like to make is that she has touched upon such a, how do I say, such a deep point, that her solution for herself is that she becomes a member of the Baha'i faith. And much of what she has spoken about has to do with the learning about and the application of the great principle of our faith, the oneness of humanity. And the whole of the civil rights movement is a reflection of that principle. But June has said it very well. But just in terms of June's response, and how grateful I am to have her to mention that. It gives opportunity, as I said, new ways of thinking and new ways of appreciating the spiritual character of the civil rights movement, which in some instances, I think, goes back to the days of Louis Gregory, goes back, I think, to the visit of Abdu'l-Baha to our country, where he sowed so many seeds that bloomed and manifested itself, I think, in the days of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. In other words, the spiritual character of the civil rights movement. So once again, thank you for this opportunity to express my gratitude to June and my warmest appreciation for another example of her wisdom and understanding and efforts to assist us in our country to appreciate some of the dimensions of our faith and its impact on civil rights and other aspects, and that our country is destined to manifest and to demonstrate to the world.
Oh, that means so much. It means so much coming from you, Mr. Barnes. And now I'm embarrassed because I don't know if the book lives up to,
No, it does.
to your estimation. But I will say that there are several of us that are trying just what you talked about, this to put forth the Baha'i vision as a response to the problem of racial disunity as a way to engage in public discourse. And so this book is one such effort. And so the hope is that it will be read by a wide audience. I'm very happy that many members of the Baha'i faith have been buying this book, but I really wrote it for the public, you know, hoping that they would begin to see the exceptionality of this one community. But we're also, so some of us are putting together a book, the Baha'i Faith and African American Studies, a second book that in which a chapter explains more closely the Baha'i concept of public accommodations and the Baha'i concept of voting rights. So that will come out from Lexington Press, hopefully in the next year or two. And then also there's an article accepted with the Journal of Baha'i Studies that I think is a more direct, they've accepted it. I don't know where it is. It hasn't come out yet, but that's a more direct statement. So hoping, you know, Richard and I, we're just hoping to put these efforts out, again, engaging in this public discourse that the Universal House of Justice urged us to do whenever we're able to. But no matter what anybody says, everybody else could be extremely critical of the book and tell me I just totally messed it up. But I have your comment now and it is taped. So I will just go back and play that little piece of the tape whenever I feel bad, when I feel bad about myself.
Oh, don't feel bad. So thank you so much, Mr. Barnes. We're going to move on because we have 7 or 8 people in the Q&A. So thank you so much again. So Jessica Turner says that was brilliant. I loved how you framed the CRM, the critical race. No, CRM. What does CRM stand for there? And the teachings of the faith. What efforts are you most excited about at present?
Oh gosh, I wish I could say. I wish I could say, you know, it's so interesting because, you know, there's so many efforts that have been started that are wonderful, that lead nowhere. And again, you know, we have guidance on that, that there are many fits and starts, and yet they don't necessarily lead anywhere. So they're great efforts. Of course, we try to do some things on the ground, you know, so we try to engage with our own neighbors. You know, we have to do that, and we have to work with youth, especially Black youth. And I see that emerging all over the country. But in terms of national movements, or national initiatives, I mean, equal justice initiative, there are wonderful things that are happening, but I don't really see them as the true answer to social reform. I think it has to be learning about this very intimate, you know, what does it mean to actually love one another? And I think the Baha'i faith is trying to orchestrate some of those efforts, not just among our own members, but in the public at large. And I have most faith in that. I don't have as much faith in some of the other efforts that I see.
Okay, great. We do have someone asking a broad question about constructive resilience, but I want to leave that till a little later if we have time. Meanwhile, I want to move on. Janae Brody says, June, wonderful presentation. Do you think the idea of protagonist speaks to each of us taking a leadership role?
Yes, yes, indeed. That's wonderful. Thank you, Janae. That's a wonderful analogy, because that's exactly what Septima Clark was saying to Dr. King. She was saying, we have to build capacity for each of us to become protagonists of our own future and protagonists of efforts. And so, yes, you're right. I should have thought of that before. No, I think that's a great way to think about it. Instead of depending on this major, you know, some very famous leader, then can we act in ways that bring the future that we want to see?
Okay, I think that's a great answer. And thank you so much, Janae, for that question. So Gary says, Gary Colliver, do you think you could view the civil rights movement, or that the civil rights movement could be viewed today as one of many lines of action addressing critical problems facing humanity, to which the Baha'i framework of action can be applied to address them, at least from a Baha'i perspective?
Absolutely. So yes, it would be similar to other movements, in the sense that many movements have recognized that there is some fundamental injustice. And I'm thinking, for example, about the environmental movement or the environmental justice movement, or anti-apartheid or reconciliation in South Africa. So yes, for sure, it's just one of many efforts to address some fundamental social need. And it just happens to be, though, it happens not just the classical movement, but the longer effort for civil rights dating all the way back to post-Civil War, US Civil War. It happens to be the one of the ones most visible, in particular, related to this issue of racial unity, which seems to be such a lasting problem in this country. So it was important for that reason.
Okay, great. So John Dugas says, could you speak a little about the institute process as a tool to achieving race unity? I know you kind of glossed over it, but perhaps you could speak to that as a line of action as well.
Yeah, so I think we're still learning about that. This isn't something that's completely worked out. And it actually, that was some of the guidance from the world governing body, Universal House of Justice, that I've grown into. At first, it was very difficult to see this. But now I think we have examples, particularly because of this wonderful video series that we have. It's called A Rich Tapestry, and it's put out by the National Spiritual Assembly, and it shows how in very everyday circumstances, such as gathering with your neighbors to say prayers, or gathering neighborhood children, varied race and ethnic backgrounds, to teach them to understand the true nature of being a human being, of virtue, that we can begin to create a context that does not allow for the breeding of races. Because if you're dealing with racism just on at the level of book learning, or the level of, see this movie or see this TV show, that doesn't have the same power as in one of the slides, I referred to this idea of intimate conversation. When you're having intimate conversation with people, particularly over a number of years, or particularly over their lifespan, then they are able to begin to see others as human beings. But of course, that requires a certain amount of effort, reflective action to do that. And to be perfectly honest, it requires some racial mixture, so if you live in a place that has no diversity, it's difficult to create the kinds of intimate activities that would help people to do that. So the Institute process allows for that effort to take place through a very well-tried and true system of education for children, for junior youth, and for adults, as well as a conceptual framework for thinking about social and economic development, as well as thinking about public discourse. So that's a lot of terms. I'm so sorry, but those are all part of the Institute process, and whoever's interested, we certainly have materials on that, and I'm sure the Institute, the Wilmette Institute, would be happy to provide those.
Thank you. And you mentioned breeding, and so I thought immediately of the work of Ibram X. Kendi and what he's been talking about in terms of becoming anti-racist from you're a baby.
Yes.
So okay, great. So we have Thelma. She's raised her hand for a while now. She says, a friend of mine once said that he thought desegregation had done more harm to the Black community than good. I know that when schools were desegregated, we lost many, many Black teachers and Black children, even in predominantly Black schools. We were taught by white teachers who had no belief in their capacity, nor empathy, nor love. I went to segregated schools and our Black teachers believed in us, loved us, and pushed us. Any comment?
Yeah, so gosh, I wish I could write another book just about that. In this book, I try to talk about my own teachers and my father's teachers, and just the qualities that were evident in our hometown with Black teachers. And then to describe a little bit of what happened after desegregation. Many of the principals became assistant principals, many teachers lost their jobs, but I didn't go into detail. I think that would take another book. There's a really good book, Schoolhouse Activists is the name of it, I think, that the whole book is about first, what were Black teachers able to do during the era of segregation? And then what could they not do once they were demoted to inferior positions after this desegregation? So the best I could do was give reference to those. So that was reaching the limit of what my publisher was giving me in terms of page length. But I think, and I said when I was giving these talks in South Carolina, some of them, one was, for example, to the University of South Carolina. I said, I'm hoping some of the graduate students and teachers in the audience will arise and carry forth this story, and talk in particular about recent years and what has happened in this period so long after desegregation in terms of the quality of education for Black students. But yeah, definitely the conclusion I reach is that it was a great loss. You know, personally, it was a great loss for me. I described that quite vividly. And also for many Black children, but I wasn't able to give it the space that I felt it deserved to really discuss this more fully.
Okay, great. So next we have a comment. It's not really a question from Joanne. She says, I want to thank June for sharing the point of love through intimate conversations as the bedrock for change. And I also like that idea when you had the slide with the bedrock, it was really spoke to me. So thank you, Joanne, for pointing that out. And then Heather, who is the one who had brought up from the beginning constructive resilience. She has a more pointed question now. She's asking, how do we, as American Baha'is, learn about applying constructive resilience to the to us and living in this culture of contest?
Yeah. So first of all, just a little bit of definition, a little bit more definition. So constructive resilience, there's actually a literature on that concept. And all praises to the Association for Baha'i Studies. Some years ago, they sponsored for several of us a seminar. It was a summer seminar held at the Highlander Institute on the concept of constructive resilience. And we gathered together several sources on that concept, including many, many letters from the Universal House of Justice, but also letters about Gandhi and his concepts, as well as other material on constructive resilience and constructive resistance. So it's a complex concept. Carl, I forgot his last name, has written a book about that that's available through the Association for Baha'i Studies. But in a practical sense, the way I use the concept, and by the way, this was a concept I knew when I began to write the book that I would draw upon. The way I used it was to describe the resilient efforts of Black people in my hometown and in my home state to raise good children, well-educated children, even under Jim Crow. So I use the concept with all apologies, because I know they're not exemplars, but to describe my parents, you know, basically this is what my parents did to try to raise us with values, even though we were living under this oppressive system. And then I talked about my hometown and the other parents and the teachers and the steps that they undertook. And then I talked about the rural areas and what was done there to try to, especially in Clarendon County. So what I learned from that is this concept, which the Universal House of Justice uses in particular. This is the worldwide governing body of the Baha'i faith, to talk about how Baha'is in Iran should live, which because they are living under a very oppressive regime. And the main concept is that they should still be highly principled with high values in their everyday actions. And they should have, if nothing else, higher moral standards than the people who are oppressing them. And that they should carry on their lives under those principles. So that was such a fantastic idea that I used it at several points to describe the events I was narrating. But that's a wonderful question, because certainly we're in the same situation. I mean, we are now in the situation when we have the battle of the political parties, when we have basically states who are identifying as red or blue with almost nothing in between. And we have network stations that are in one direction or another direction. And so we have this very fragmented, dare I say, hostile environment for anyone who just wants to live a good life. So then I see what we should do, and she specifically said we as Baha'is, is we should think, okay, so how can I rise above the fray? And how can I live a life that is free of those encumbrances and that essentially it reflects the higher principles that human beings are capable of? And how can I raise a family that is that way and not get involved in all the turmoil and basically not get involved in the negativity, but instead maintain that posture of friendliness and humility and spirituality? You know, how can I maintain a life as a spiritual being? So yeah, I think the concepts, I mean, my book is just this one example. There's a wonderful literature on constructive there. Oh, I should mention the Association for Baha'i Studies also issued a wonderful special issue on constructive resilience, filled with stories about how people interpreted that concept. I think it came out about a year ago. But this is what better time to practice that. I mean, this is one of the most hostile, bifurcated eras I can remember, you know, in the past few decades. And so this is a great time to practice living above the fray.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it was Michael Carlberg. Anybody in the audience who has not heard of him can Google and find more online about this thing about constructive resilience. He's written quite a lot, and I'm sure there's some available to read and download online. So thank you for that. So Jeanette is suggesting to us that it would be useful, or she's asking, would it be useful? I'm suggesting it would be useful to use this book in a library book discussion.
Yeah,
I think so personally, and any kind of book discussion that you have, you know, it doesn't have to be in a library, but a library is definitely a good place. And
yeah, just one comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two versions of the book. There's the hardback paper version, and there's also an ebook that is available on several platforms for including Amazon Kindle. And the advantage of the ebook is it has discussion questions in the back. The paper version doesn't have that. But if you get the e-version, it has 15 or 20 questions that could be used for a book club. And so I would, if you're going to do that, I would recommend that you consider at least one person getting that ebook. And interesting thing, they sent me the questions. They developed the questions and they sent me the questions and they were perfect. I said, oh. So it's a very good list of questions, I think, to get conversation started.
Awesome. So Mary McGregor would love to see this book promoted in bookstores such as African American store, the Dock Bookshop in Fort Worth. Is this something you do to help get this out there across the country? And I would say to Dennis and Mary that you should go to the bookstore and say, you know, you don't see this book. Can you please get it for me? That's one good way to get the book into stores if people want it and ask the bookstore for it. And then Christian Hansen says, do you see a need for a truth and reconciliation effort in the Baha'i community to address the wounded souls and upraise the awareness of the white community that this is still a vital and challenging issue far from being resolved?
Yeah, I'm reaching because I had handy, there's a wonderful letter from the National Spiritual Assembly. It was on June 19th, 2020, the Juneteenth letter that talked about that. And this is what they said. and this is the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. An essential element of the process will be honest and truthful discourse about current conditions and their causes, and understanding in particular the deeply entrenched notions of anti-Blackness that pervade our society. So yes, we need to have this conversation inside the Baha'i community. Just as a reminder to Baha'is, Shoghi Effendi said that we needed a double crusade. We needed to reform our own community and also the society at large. Having said that, I think we have to be very careful because unfortunately, Baha'is, we tend to be inwardly looking quite often. You know, we spend a lot of time with each other because we love each other so much, you know. So we spend days together, you know, every evening, and then we want to be so perfect within our own community. And before you know it, nobody knows that. I mean, you know, we've reached this state of perfection in our community, but, you know, what about everybody else? So I think we have to balance the effort to reform our own Baha'i community with efforts to be more outwardly oriented and to begin to engage other people, not just ourselves. So something like a truth and reconciliation, something within the Baha'i faith, that's not my vision of what needs to happen, but you know, maybe some other people feel in a particular situation, like a particular circumstance where there's been like egregious wrongs or something, you know, at a small scale, but I don't foresee that that would work beyond that small scale. But who am I to say? I think that's a question for the National Spiritual Assembly.
All right. Well, we have a few more questions here, so we do have a little more time. Probably can do another 10 minutes. Let's see. In Jeru says, I was June Thomas's student in Michigan State and learned from her that human identity is primary and my African identity secondary. That gave me energy to work for race unity. Can June comment on the question of identity? And she says, I love June.
Jeru called. Oh my goodness, please. I have a special email in Jeru. It's june@junemanningthomas.com. We haven't heard from you in too long, so please contact us. So this is a wonderful, wonderful man that Richard and I both taught. And yeah, those were happy years at Michigan State University. He spent many happy days in our living room, and we took him through, you know, introduced him to many writings in the Baha'i faith. And so very happy to hear from him. And yeah, so I think he's raising a good point, because so many of us, you know, like many of us, we have this very strong identity as African American, or we might have a strong identity, like my mother had a very strong identity as Bahamian, and then, you know, as Kenyan, or whatever. And
Jamaican.
Jamaican, you know, whatever the identities are. And there's room for that. But of course, the teaching of Baha'u'llah is that we are one human race. And what we need to do is to recognize that even though there might be differences, that we don't want to eliminate those differences, but we want to recognize the commonalities. And it's only through such commonalities that we can really advance as a human race. So then that is a good reminder of what we should be aiming for. Because, for example, you say African American, and yet many people say, well, yeah, I'm African American, but I'm really from Detroit. Or, you know, I'm really from New York, or, you know, I'm not rich and you are, you know, whatever. So there are divisions, always divisions within these national identities. And the only true way to bridge those divisions is to look at our spiritual selves and the essential unity of humanity. So yes, very happy to hear that basically he remembers that we said that. I don't remember saying that, but evidently we did.
Cool. So Heather has a few more comments, and then there are no more questions that I can see. So if anyone else has a question, quick put it in the chat or in the Q&A. Heather says, thank you. I hope to find that issue from the Association of Baha'i Studies on Constructive Resilience. She says she's been reading Carlberg's work, that's Michael Carlberg, for years, and strive to do what June described, to live above the fray. I love your book and will do all I can to promote among my friends. She also says a number of Baha'is in my state and area simply do not understand or suspect institutionalized racism. They do think it is all taken care of. So hard to not react in a harsh way when I hear these comments. So I don't know if June has any thoughts about ways, I can think of quotes from Abdul Baha about what to do when you are wanting to react in a harsh way.
Yeah, so I think there is nothing that beats having sustained conversations with people. That could be a book club or a devotional meeting or something over a period of months and years. So forming some sort of study group or some sort of discussion group. So we can't change like 50 people very easily, but forming a group of 8 or 10, to have conversations, ongoing conversations about these issues, I think is the way to go. And this reminds me that I should say, I'm very happy that people are enthusiastic about the book and sharing it with their friends, but I hope you will share it with them in a joint effort, like a joint discussion or a joint book club, because that's the opportunity to highlight the implications for your own club or your own workplace or your own neighborhood. And I worry about people who on their own read this book.
Right.
I will warn you, they're difficult portions. They're difficult portions. One woman wrote me last week, and she said, I've just read chapter 3, and I'm so mad. If I were white, I'd want to scratch off the white. That's what she said. That's what she said. And so I wrote her back. First of all, I wish, this is a kind of person that I would hope, needed to be in a group study, studying with someone. But I wrote her back and I said, please keep reading. I said, because, basically I talk about many of the whites who arose, even in that situation, to assist the civil rights movement. And I talk about the Baha'i community. And in the last chapter, I talk about the negative forces and how those were opposed by constructive forces. There were destructive forces and constructive forces. So to be perfectly honest, it a little bit freaked me out because I said, oh my God, she read 3 chapters. And I said, I hope she didn't go to bed on that. Because the chapters she read.
The worst part first.
Yeah, you don't want to stop. I mean, as it gets more and more solution driven.
Yes.
So I wrote her back and I said, please. So some of you have said, I'm going to send or send it, give it to my friends. And I would hope, again, we're in a joint educational process about race. And I would hope that you would consider reading it with your friend instead of giving it to your friend or suggesting it to your friend, and using that as an occasion to build relationships that can then possibly turn into something else, maybe a study group that happens after that, or a study circle happens after that.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. There's something I wanted to move on to. I forgot there was a lovely thing in the chat from Wilmington. Our friend Roger Hamrick says, here in Wilmington, North Carolina, there is a group who are referred to as the lowercase leaders. These are youth who have taken the role of leading the community toward racial justice. The group saw the uppercase leaders, for example, the NAACP, as moving too slowly to address issues. So that's something that's happening in North Carolina. The youth are
Oh,
doing this.
as they should. I mean, if we could get some youthful leadership, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And there's a couple more here. I'm losing my chat here. Okay. Marcia Veach. I know Marcia. Let's see. She says we use the National is it Council on Racial Amity? They have a Be the Change study guide, NRCA's Be the Change study guide, which we found helpful in the discussion about our individual role. She says she used it with both Baha'is and other friends, and she will introduce June's book for the next steps. Great, that's awesome.
Yeah, National Race Amity Conferences. Yeah, that would be one organization that is highly recommended. Yeah.
And someone is asking if you're doing a book tour. I know you just came back from a book tour in South Carolina. Are there any tours coming up otherwise?
Well, I'm supposed to go down to Clemson to Roy Jones, who's a Baha'i there, who works with a wonderful program for Black men called Call Me Mister. These are Black men who have been recruited to teach in K through 12 education. And so I'm speaking to them next week. But I'm not sure I see myself on a book tour. You know, I don't know. Yeah.
Hard life of an author.
Yeah, I have other things in life, you know, so I'm not sure.
Well, I can tell there's more books in you, though. You mentioned you wish you could write this book or that book. So, you know,
yeah, I'm not sure of that either. This book took a lot out of me because I had to remember things. I had to go back and remember some things I'd written notes on, but I still had to go back, like the descriptions of Jim Crow or the descriptions of
Did you interview some family and friends?
No, what I did, I talked to a couple of them, but the main methodology was historical archives. So it's mainly a memoir / historical archives strategy. So yeah, I think there's room for more books that do more interviews. And the reason I did that was because of distance, and also because I do a lot of historical archives work. And I was amazed to discover that many archives existed that I didn't know existed. I discovered them in 2017. And they served the purpose because I had started to forget. And so with art, I could not write a memoir, but with the archives, I was able to supplement memories and add other things besides just my own life or my family's life. But someone else, yeah, we need more books of people who focus more on interviews or other methods, such as statistical analysis or other methods that people could use.
And one of our attendees, Rich, says he wrote an autobiography about how racism impacted his life when he wanted to marry a Black woman in 1968. It's called Never Did Say Goodbye. He says it's wonderful to know your story. Thank you. Now, we have a couple more questions on comments in the Q&A, but I think it's time we need to wrap up. I know that you have another Zoom to get on soon, so thank you so much, June. I don't know if Rob can make it back on to see if he had any closing comments he wanted to say, but thank you so much.
Really, June, we're very, very grateful for your time and for you writing the book and for helping us out with our anti-Black racism courses, which have now been taken by 900 people. And the credit version of the course now, of course, Reconstructing Blackness, and you were able to help us with that. And really, we're immensely grateful for all of the efforts you've been making for decades for the advancement of the principles of the faith and service to humanity. And I don't know if I can say anything more than that, because I'm not really adequate to offer you the thanks that you deserve.
Oh, well, goodness, everything's a joint project. You know, Janae Brody and Gwen Etter Lewis, and so many people helped with the course, and everything is a joint effort with given, you know, with joy. So, but thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Nikki, for stepping in when my internet was unstable. I'm very grateful for that. And I want to thank our audience again for joining us today. We have another program next week, next Sunday, with 3 women talking about basically the family budgeting and these kinds of Baha'i financial kind of ideas. And we hope that will be of great use to people as well. So again, thank you everyone, and have a good remainder of your weekend, and goodbye from the Wilmette Institute.